All right. The first one, I apologize if I get your name wrong. We're going to take Vaclav from the Czech Republic. It sounds like you want to talk about miracles today.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, what do you believe about miracles?
Okay, hello, and I am sorry, I'm a little bit nervous because this is my first time in this show. But maybe I would like to start a little bit more broader. I am atheist, or let's say very fresh atheist, but still I am wondering what actually is the evidence what we need to prove that the God exists, or at least that we have a very good reason to think so.
All right, Richard,
What
do you want to jump
evidence
in on
would we
this?
need? Yeah. What evidence would we need to prove that God exists? I don't know. I honestly don't know, because there is nothing that I can see in reality that suggests that God does exist. What that evidence would be to prove that he exists is beyond me at the moment. If that evidence were to exist, and if God were to exist, then we'd have it. I think is the simple answer to that. I think there are many people who have different ideas about evidence, whether that it can't be naturalistic, that it's got to be philosophical only. I don't see how that can work. I think when most cases of philosophical evidence for God rely on natural scientific evidence to demonstrate them anyway. So whichever way you're going around it, you're going to be looking in some form at empirical evidence, and we simply don't have it. That's the easy answer, Ben.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to say as well, because I don't know what specific piece of evidence would convince me, but for me it's maybe less of the actual piece of evidence as it is the demonstration of a causal relationship. And with this, if you could give me any piece of evidence, or any point that could point you in that direction of believing in a higher power, and you could demonstrate, probably with statistics, which makes it very difficult, that there is a causal relationship between these variables. And then also we're able to control for variables that could also be contributing. I probably would be convinced if you could get all of those numbers together to where you could demonstrate causality. I would I would probably believe something. The difficulty there is, how do you exclude variables as contributing factors, and then also uh, how do we rule in or rule out, or specifically rule out? Because I mean, you can technically rule in anything, but how do you rule out a deity? And that's where we get into some muddy ground, I think, on that. Richard, do you have any thoughts on that, or even, or
Yeah,
either of your thoughts?
I think one way that is attempted to by theists to try and prove God is that they try and kind of go with the miracle claim aspect, and I'd like to hear the caller's opinion on this,
Mhm.
and how, if at all, can we demonstrate God through miracles?
Well, this is a very tricky question, according to me. But if we can sort out the claims of the miracles which are offered to us by the theists, then there are centrally the very rare occurrences, like, I don't know, miracle healings or very strange coincidences. Sorry for my English, by the way. But those things actually aren't, according to me, the proofs of the God existence, because as you said, there is no way to rule out the natural factors, and by the way, the things are just happened because the universe is pretty big, and so there is pretty big chance even for the very unlikely occurrences.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that when we're talking about miracle claims, we have to be careful as well, because there are two definitions of miracle that I think are sometimes conflated. There is the one which is and I'm using the Merriam-Webster definition here, is an extraordinary event manifesting divine intervention in human affairs, which is, I think, what most theists mean when they talk about miracles. The second meaning is an extremely outstanding or unusual event, thing, or accomplishment. And I think the problem is that those two definitions, when we're talking about miracles, especially from a biblical perspective, get conflated. And I think for me, we can split miracle claims in the Bible into different categories. We can talk about those which are replicable by other means, such as Jesus walking on the water, which we can see magicians doing. So that's not something we can definitively say is a miracle. We can talk about those which are exceptionally unlikely. And this is where they fall into the second category, the second definition of miracles, because they fall into the idea of large numbers. They're known as mathematical miracles. And, they talk about things that are exceptionally unlikely to happen. And those are cited as miracles in the Bible as well, such as Abraham and Sarah conceiving Isaac in old age. It's an exceptionally unlikely thing to happen, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Mm-hmm. And then we've got those which appear to contradict the laws of nature or the laws of logic, such as people coming back from the dead. And I think that those are the three categories that I see in the Bible, but yet they're all conflated as to miraculous events attributable to God, and I just don't think that they are. What flavor of theist were you when you were a believer, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I was a Catholic. That's why I actually prepared the communion miracle, which actually occurred in the Poland recently. But I would like to get to this later. I actually think that it's strange for me, or more like amusing, that the most of the miracles which are described in the Bible actually was performed even before Jesus by many magicians and philosophers. For example, I think it was Pythagoras who claimed that, or his apprentice claimed that he walked on the water and raised one child from death. So these things were actually very common in the culture. And I think that the first two kind of miracles, these rare occurrences, actually aren't proof at all. But I am interested in the third type of miracle, unlogical thing which happened in contrast with the known laws or physics and biology, etc.
Right. So this ends up being an interesting conversation, because with that definition of miracle, if we're saying something that is outside of the realm of what we believe to be possible within reality, they have two extra things that they have to do, because it's pretty easy, at least if you're just claiming that, hey, this is a really uncommon event that we know can happen, but this particular case was caused by a deity. That's much easier to argue, because then at least I can demonstrate that this is possible. And then you only have to demonstrate that God was the cause of said event, or some supernatural being was the cause of that. But now you add in something that is completely outside the realm of what we know to be possible. Now you have to demonstrate not only that the higher power was the cause, but you have to demonstrate that the thing happened at all. So a technique that I like to use, I kind of take a medical approach to the way that I argue, and I find it to be kind of helpful. Like, I take out a whiteboard and I will ask the other person to specifically tell me what claim they're making. So if they're talking about miracles, I'd probably ask them to narrow it down. Pick one miracle that you think is the most convincing to you. And if they say water being turned into wine, cool. So we take that miracle. We start with, so this is what we believe happened. But what could have caused this presentation to take place? So if I believe that this water looks like wine, I don't know for sure if it is or it isn't, but I can go back and say what could have caused this to happen. Number one could be that it actually was turned into wine. That's a possibility. I'm not going to discard that, especially if you're talking with somebody else. I don't want them to think you're just intentionally throwing their argument out the window. I want them to think through the problem. So you start off with their idea, and then you kind of ask them to give some other possibilities that they think could have played into it. Like maybe what if somebody behind the scenes was kind of working with Jesus and switching out the bottles and just nobody saw this happen? That's a possibility, right? Or what if somebody added like some kind of dye or like food coloring to the water? Like there are different possibilities, and then you can, after you have a list of them, you can go back and say, okay, what's the likelihood that this is the cause? And then you can figure out, how would I determine whether or not somebody was behind the scenes changing things? And then they have to think through, okay, well, maybe this is likely. I haven't necessarily ruled this one out yet. Because I think the problem here is a lot of people will take the end result and they'll intuitively think what their brain's going to go to for why it happened. We oftentimes follow an A to C route. So if A is the cause and C is the end, people oftentimes miss step B in the middle. And sometimes you have to check yourself and go back in your thought process and think, how did I get from A to C? Are there steps in between that I just didn't think of? And why am I so prone to think that this one possibility is the only one? And this is something that it's a form of anchoring bias. So once you have in your brain that this answer is the most likely, it's very difficult to overcome that anchoring bias and think of other possibilities. So that's a technique that I like to use. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that, or different ways that you approach this conversation with people.
Actually, I think this technique sounds kind of cool, and I think I'm starting it using in my thinking process about miracles. By the way, this miracle with wine, for me, the most simple answer is that the people who reported this, if it's really happened, were completely drunk when it occurred. So there is a problem with the source from the beginning. But for example, I mentioned the Eucharistic miracles in the Catholic Church. They believe that those wafers or those wine is magically turned into the blood and real flesh of the Jesus Christ. Well, and it's mean literally. When I was a Christian, I actually believed that there is some kind of essence or something like that, because it's very hard to love someone and then eat his flesh and drink his blood. I mean, it sounds like from some cheap horror. But there is a claim by the church from Poland, and of course from other countries around the world, namely from Mexico and Argentina, that during some occurrences, during some masses, there are just happen that some of those wafers just fall on the ground, and so it's put into the bowl with the water to dissolve it, Eucharistia, and remove it, because germs and so on. And during these occurrences, the church claims, or the priests who did this claims that those wafers just changed into the real physical blood and physical meat of Jesus Christ, literally. And it was sent in each cases. It was sent to university on pathology. I think that this is a little bit a game from the church, but that doesn't matter. And on the pathology, it was confirmed or claimed by the researchers that there was found some remnants of the human tissue. I mean, I think from the heart muscle tissue.
Yeah,
So-
the
so
difficulty with these claims is that they're not thoroughly tested. And I was having a conversation with a Catholic recently about it was from Argentina actually, about a similar. It wasn't the exact case you cited, but it was a similar event where they took some soft tissue and found it to have lasted longer than it should be, and there's no corroboration of these. The idea is that we say this, it's sent away, it's tested, but who's doing the testing? Who's doing the work to find out if this is actually the case? Which medical bodies are involved?
right, that's my
was-
question too.
I was cited a medical paper from I think it was from 1976, which apparently evidenced a miracle claim from 1988, I think it was. And the person who I was talking to didn't even seem to realize that they'd given evidence from a paper that was published over 10 years before the actual miracle took place.
Yeah.
This is how kind of invested people are in these ideas. But Ben, you wanted to say something later.
Yeah, I mean, my whole thing was, how do we know that this study wasn't falsified? Like, how do we know that they didn't submit the wafer and a slice of tissue from like a cow heart or something? I don't have enough to say that this was actually that they sent in just the wafer and the wine and then got back a pathology report saying that it was cardiac muscle tissue. Like that's a leap that I'm not willing to grant them just on their word for it. Like certain things I can take somebody more at their word for being a less extraordinary claim, right? Like if I were to send a tissue sample from a surgical case that was of someone's heart surgery, like if someone had a mass removed from their heart and they sent it off to pathology, it would not take very much to convince me that the pathology report said that this was cardiac tissue, because it's consistent with what we know about heart muscle and where we took the mass from. But now, if people are saying that I submitted a communion wafer and this was read as cardiac muscle tissue, that takes a lot more for me to confirm that this is actually what was read and they didn't pull data from other places, or they didn't skew the results in some way. So I wouldn't be convinced by that, and I'm honestly amazed that people aren't thinking through the holes in that particular study, if we can even call it a study. I don't know if I'm convinced that it is a study, in all honesty.
I think for me, part of the difficulty is in the very way that the Catholic Church defines a miracle, because their definition of it is a sign or a wonder, such as healing or control of nature, which can only be attributed to a divine power. And I don't think there's any miracle that, even if we talked about the third category, such as people being raised from the dead earlier, I don't think there's any miracle that's sufficient to say that they are only attributable to a divine power. If somebody appeared to be, I mean, and we have the idea that people raised from the dead all the time, but what I'm talking about is when you're brain dead, when you're clinically dead, because death, of course, is a process. and you're not actually dead until you're brain dead. And a lot of the accounts of people coming back from death, they're not actually dead when they're revived.
Yeah.
So if we talk about someone who's actually brain dead, who's revived, that what the Catholic Church is essentially doing is, right, in that instance, it's automatically God. There are no other candidate explanations. This is exactly what we're going to. And I just think it's a failure. I think it's a failure of the very definition that they use to attribute it to that. I just, like I said at the start of the show, start of the call, I just do not see any situation where you can categorically say this is a miracle, this is a supernatural event attributable. I can't speak that word.
Well, but
To God.
even with that, like talking about brain death and people coming back from the dead, there are several criteria that you have to meet to actually be declared brain dead. So I'm currently on an ICU rotation right now, and unfortunately, I've seen brain death on this rotation. I've assessed people for brain death, and in order to classify somebody as brain dead, you have to go through all of their reflexes, because certain reflexes are last to go and are indicative of certain brainstem functions that they might still have a little bit of. You have to like make sure they're not sedated for, I think, 72 hours, and then you test them. You do an apnea test, so you see if they can they have some respiratory drive at all. So there's multiple criteria to declare somebody brain dead. And so if you have to go through this process of several days before you're declared brain dead, it's very difficult to then say, yeah, this person was like technically dead. They were pulseless. They had whatever other criteria. But if they were only that way for a few hours or even like a day, we don't have the necessary data to even declare them brain dead. So it could be that they still have like seizure activity going on. And you might be brain dead and have seizure activity, but you also might not be. So if we were to remove the cause of your seizure, it's possible that you weren't actually brain dead and were in a comatose state. So there's a lot going on with that. But any kind of last thoughts on the miracles, because I know we're going a bit on some different tangents here.
Oh yeah.
But do you have any more thoughts about this?
Well, I actually personally was a little bit obsessed with these kind of Eucharistic miracles, and now I can say that that most of these occurrences seems to be false alarms. For example, those from Argentina, I think that their sample what they had, what they have actually got bigger over the time when they have it, and those actually indicated it's much more likely some kind of fungi or some kind of the mold, because there are a lot of type of molds which actually are not only red, but so they resemble the blood, but they are also resembles in many times the heart tissue, because the heart tissue there are those long stripes with the center cells in them, and sometimes it's very similar, and it's very hard, or it could be theoretically hard for someone in pathology to make a clear difference if they don't know what they actually have, and they are prone to see, especially mostly the human tissue. But this is just a speculation.
Well, yeah, especially if a pathologist, a medical pathologist, is trained in human pathology. They're not trained in analyzing fungi or other organisms. So there's already bias entering the equation, because they're looking at the sample, and the only thing they can really analyze is human. So it's again more of that anchoring bias of they see something that looks like heart tissue. In their experience, all they work with is human tissue. So it's reasonable for them to say, this is probably consistent with what I deal with every day, when it might not be. If someone snuck into your lab one day and decided to swap out your samples with mushroom tissue, like how many pathologists would think about, oh yeah, somebody walked in here and swapped out my samples? It's unlikely, but it's still not it's not outside of what is possible within our reality. People walk in and prank people all the time. It's not unreasonable to think that. But I think we're gonna move on to some other calls. But thank you for calling in. This was a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, great call. Thank you.
Mhm.
Have a good rest of your Sunday.